Well,
Should we get started?
yeah, let's get started. It looks like we have at least a reasonable number.
Well,
Got a
do you
few
guys
more.
want to start off with any CAC business, or do you want to just jump right into the Reimagine stuff? Or
I guess I would remind folks that Roger had sent out contact information and bios, and if any of you have any corrections, contact Roger with, whatever you want to say about yourself that he didn't say. So we're ready to go, and take it away, Julie.
all right, Bill, did you want to kick us off at all?
Well, again, thanks for having us again. We kind of short notice, but we're certainly have an exercise that we just went through with our technical working group and advisory committee last week. So it's kind of fresh on our minds. So we thought we could, fill the gap in your agenda today. And I think it's a good, conversation to have, given where we're at, I think, as an agency, which is, again, more discussion about trade-offs and discussions about potential scenarios that we could face in the future, given, some of what we know today. And, obviously, like I'm sure Julie's going to say, we could never predict the future, but at least we can think about different alternative futures and what that may mean for us. And that's kind of what this exercise is meant to do. So with that, I will turn to Julie.
Great. Thank you so much. We're excited to do this with you guys. It's a thought exercise. So there is no right or wrong answers. Obviously, we're looking out way into the future. But really, it is about those discussions of trade-offs and priorities. And those are tough calls. Those are some of the biggest challenges that the RTD board's facing. So we talked about this last time, so I won't go into a lot of detail. This is the longer term piece that we're focusing on. So this is in support of the mobility plan for the future. And as Bill said, to reiterate from last time, the one thing that we can guarantee is whatever we predict about the future is going to be wrong. And so again, we're trying to look at a universe of potential futures or plausible futures, sort of a universe of where we think the future can take us. And that is really driven by, we had a lot of conversations with the TWG and the AC and other working groups that we've been working with on the technical side of what are those key drivers that really will impact RTD in a major, major way. And so that is how we got to these first these four scenarios. So what are the biggest drivers? I think we would all agree money. Money is a really, really, really big driver, right? The other challenge RTD has is workforce. So obviously you can have all the money in the world. If you don't have the workforce, you're still in the same situation, meaning it has the same impact on the organization. Whether you're talking about money or workforce, it is a detriment or a challenge to provide the service that the region needs if you don't have enough funding or if you don't have enough workforce. So that is the x-axis in our scenario planning. Where do you have in workforce and where do you have funding in terms of RTD's ability to provide the service that's needed? The other, on the y-axis, really what we came down to was the biggest driver is going to be what is going to change, or is there going to be a change in travel demand? And obviously a lot of that is driven by telecommuting. We've had dramatic, changes, people working at home. We're all talking about trying to getting back to the offices maybe next year, but it's been a long time. And the question is, and the question we do not have an answer for at this point is this a long-term or is this a short-term? So next year, by middle of next year, are we all just back into our normal commute patterns? You still have the peak in the morning and the peak in the afternoon. And it's very similar to what we saw before, a lot of commuter traffic coming into the central business district. Or is this a change for good? And suddenly now everybody's going to be either working at home more or some sort of hybrid model where you only go downtown or go to your work every few days. So we've developed these four scenarios around those two major drivers. So the ability for RTD to provide the service, either financially or for workforce, and what is the demand for the service at that time. And this is future looking, so 2030, 2050. Obviously, like I said, there is no right or wrong answers, but what we'd like to do is lay out several scenarios. We'll walk through them first. Sort of what are we assuming? And then we have an exercise where we go through each scenario and we say, okay, what would you prioritize under this scenario? What sort of trade-offs would you face under this scenario, under this reality moving forward? So we're a really small group. Let's keep this super informal. Feel free to unmute yourself, ask questions, throw notes in the chat. Just like I said, we don't have to wait for any sort of formality here. We just love your thoughts on this. So with that, I will jump right in. Oh, the one other thing I should mention is the table on the right. So we mentioned last time that we have this really interesting new tool that we're using, and it is a tool that works in concert with the travel demand model to try to estimate what are the impacts of some of these things. And so you'll see a very big dramatic change in boardings, kind of depending on the different scenarios, and then a little bit more nuanced change on some of the others, like the transit mode or how much of the equity populations across the region are being impacted. So these are to give you a little bit of background as we work through sort of what the priorities in the scenarios would be. So any questions before I jump into the scenarios? Is that making sense? I see some head nodding. Okay. Like I said, interrupt me if you have questions. So yes, we got a little alliterative on these. So hopeful horizons, you'll see a little bit of we're trying to come up with names that really sort of capture this. So scenario one is hopeful horizons. So it's good news. You've got funding. So that we've got funding, we've got workforce, but what we're seeing is a lot of people are still working at home. So we've got funding increased, so we can complete fast tracks, provide even more premium service. So we are really feeling good on the financial end. We have a stable workforce, so we don't have those limitations. But people are only going, it's that hybrid model, right? People are only going, maybe a couple days a week. And so it has fairly dramatically changed the travel demand pattern and the need for transit and how transit should be scheduled. The other thing we're seeing is that people are doing shorter distance trips. They're hopping on the bus to go to grocery store, to go to a movie or something like that, or do smaller trips localized within their neighborhoods. And you're not seeing as much of a focus on those long range commuters, people coming from like north of the city into downtown, for example. So that's scenario one, hopeful horizons. Scenario two, this is the tough one. Wah, wah, wah. We call it dire days because this means we're struggling. We're struggling with workforce availability. We don't have the same level of funding that we need, and the demand is down. And so this is sort of the worst case scenario that we'd be looking at. So, so demand for e-commerce services increases. So there's a lot of people having things delivered to their house, and we're really struggling to hire operators. That there has been a transition in the workforce and people are not interested as much in these jobs. So we're having a really hard time staffing the need to meet our travel demand. That is combined with the fact that people are working at home, similar to the last model, about 2 days a week, they're only going into the office. So it's dramatically reduced and changed the amount of transit travel. They're doing those smaller neighborhood trips like we talked about. And really, it's really substantially reduced travel demand. So under this scenario, people are just not riding the buses and riding the trains as much. So that's a real challenge for us. So the third one, exploring efficiencies. This was somewhere in the middle. So we're struggling a little bit financially, but whoops, hang on, let me let this person in. Just let something in. Okay, so we're struggling with financials. We don't have the amount of money that we need, and everybody's coming back to the system. Woohoo! So our previous expenditures, we've sort of overextended ourselves. We've got some debt, so we don't have a lot of money right now for additional capital expansion. And the transit surface is not keeping up with the population. As we're going to have, hundreds of thousands of people moving in. So there's lots and lots more people here. So there's lots more demand on the system, but we can't keep up with it, basically. There's really some of the ridership and the increase in demand has been driven by a real awareness of climate change. People are seeing transit as an opportunity to really address those bigger concerns. But the problem is, bottom line, is financially RTD is just not in the position to meet the needs of the current of the district at that time based on the increase in ridership. And then finally, the last one, scenario 4, favorable future. So we have funding, which is great. FTA has allowed RTD to finish fast tracks, provide more premium service. There's a lot of interest, and the ridership is increasing because it's continued community concerns about climate change has really gotten people motivated, and so everybody's kind of pro transit, and everybody's getting back to the office. There's sort of this something clicked. Now everybody's looking at COVID in the rear view mirror, and we're all sort of going, you know what, we need to get back into the office. There's pressure from our companies. Everybody needs to get back into the office. So there's a real push from a demand in a more of traditional, what we've seen in the past sort of model, in terms of a lot of commuter travel, for example. And we also saw a huge extreme growth. So even more than the DRCOG model, we had people moving here because everybody found out Colorado's this amazing place to live. So you have funding, which is great, but there's also a lot of demand on the system. So you kind of see how the four play out. Now, and this is sort of a summary of all of them, so we can go back and review this at any point as we get into our discussions. This just lines everything up. The baseline in this scenario is the DRCOG model. And then you have the modifications you see based on, and you can see from the icons, the red on the left is telecommuting is up, and then the gray on the right is travel is up. And so Hopeful Horizons is increased in telecommuting and increase in transit. So here's what we get to do next. So now I've done the talking, now it's time for you guys. So we're going to take each of these, and I'll go back and review them real quick before we jump into this. Now,
Julie, can I ask a question? Could you go back one?
Yeah.
To that. So that baseline is DRCOG's theoretical estimate of 2050.
Yeah.
Correct.
Do you know what today's numbers are? Just out of curiosity, how they compare?
Oh, how many boardings? What
I don't mean today's with COVID. I mean
like 2019 levels.
Yeah,
2019.
I think that's the base, like the boardings, I believe, if I'm right, are about 340,000.
Yep, I was
So
going to
it's
say
like a 70% increase in transit trips and boardings over what we are today, or in 2019. Per year.
Yes.
Per year. And does the mode share change dramatically?
No, I mean, well, in some people's case, it does change dramatically, because to a lot of people, this may not be a dramatic change, but for some of us transportation planners, it is kind of dramatic, because, a 0.2 or 0.3% increase in transit mode share actually is pretty good. But it's not that probably, it's not that wow factor that you would assume, but it does reflect kind of a little bit more reality, I think.
So right now we're what, around 2%, or
yeah, 2 or maybe even 1.8 or 1.9. I know it's right around 2. It might even be just below 2.
Yeah, I was just trying to get some comparable in my head.
Right.
So I understand that small changes are a big deal, but I have to say, the biggest number here is 2.5%.
Right.
We're talking 30 years from now. That's not a very big change.
Well, so here's the other thing that we didn't present to you, that we just because of time, and it's a different kind of conversation. The other thing that we presented at our last meeting with DRCOG did announce their own scenario modeling, and they were a little bit more aspirational in terms of looking at things like land use and other things. And what the general conclusion of what they found is land use has the biggest impact on transit ridership of anything. Because the scenario where they basically increase density around transit, and then basically, I can't remember what the figure was. It was like some ridiculous amount of additional transit ridership. They increased transit ridership by 6 times, but it was one of those things where it was meant to show just what the influence of land use and transit could be, and it did clearly show that land use has a bigger impact than just pure investment in transit and infrastructure by itself. And that was really the intent.
And it really was low level. It was creating sort of land use centers, right, where you could consolidate and densification and things like that. So it was some slight changes in land use had a much more dramatic impact on the amount of boardings than actually just increasing transit availability. I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, that's not exactly surprising.
Right.
Land use is the big deal. No, again, I was just trying to get a sense, but these scenarios are interesting. I'm sure we'll discover a lot in the conversation, but I have to say still, it's kind of a little disappointing when you look at gee, even with a rosy future of money and people going back to work, 30 years from now, all we get is 2.5%. That's not exactly a huge increase.
Right.
You do assume some
Right.
big changes.
Mm-hmm. And it's 70% increase in boardings. So it is a big increase, but you're right, it does not impact. Part of that is the assumptions around population growth. As you know, by 2050, there is an assumption that there's a massive influx of individuals moving into the state, which I think impacts that mode share as well.
Yeah. Okay, well, no, that's very helpful that, that's kind of where we're at. These numbers are in a relatively small range, which I guess tells us something, but maybe it also tells us what we need to really focus on, which is some more of the land use implications, which of course RTD doesn't control, but,
Right.
but nonetheless, we could maybe nudge a little bit.
Well, educational about it as well,
Yeah.
Matt, I see you have your hand raised. Other Matt.
Yeah. Yeah, a couple of things. First, on the land use piece, I know the Colorado legislature recently passed a bill that sort of allows RTD to have a little bit more flexibility in terms of development around their transit stops. Like they're now allowed to build like housing, some commercial space around transit stations where they maybe weren't before. So I'm curious, like sort of what are the real world implications of that legislation, and has like RTD unpacked that, and like what?
Sure.
Have you guys updated the TOD policy at all?
Well, a couple things on that. The bill really, I'll just say this: it doesn't do much that we already couldn't do. And the fact is, we don't own a ton of land around our stations, and but we are working on actually the land that we do own where it makes sense. And I will say, in my staff have done an analysis of where there's opportunities, and we've identified up to like 12 or 13 stations that have a high potential for redevelopment over the next 5 to 10 years. So we're focused on those, but that's a relatively small sample of the whole region. And we can certainly have some influence, and we'll certainly benefit some from that legislation in terms of having a clear path. The other thing that we did, I think, that is more impactful to the conversation is we did adopt a equitable TOD policy with the board earlier this year that really does say RTD has a preference for affordable housing. And we've done research on our own here in Denver that says, and which makes logical sense, people in affordable housing ride transit more. So it makes more sense for us to put that around transit because we're going to get a bigger benefit from that. And so we're trying to push that as well. But in terms of the land use piece, we have a very, very minute influence on that. And we are working on it, but I'll just say it still is a challenge because there still is a lot of impediments that, that the state could not get rid of because it's either local and or federal type, impediments that are obstacles that make it more challenging for us to get to where we want to get to. But we are working on it, and we do have some things in the hopper that hopefully, cross my fingers, within this next year that we may have some ability to say that we're moving forward with some good development projects in some of our properties.
Great, thanks for that. Just the one other thing I was going to point out was the state now has an affordable housing task force that's trying to figure out what to do with something like $400 million from the American Rescue Plan. And so it'd be interesting to think about reducing the cost of housing and transportation at the same time through things like transit-oriented development. So I wonder, is RTD plugged into that affordable housing task force and thinking about, ways to leverage those funds?
I'm not sure. I don't believe so. And I think my staff and I would probably be the point people from RTD, and I don't think we've been asked to participate.
Yeah. Hey, Matt, this has been, I'm sort of plugged into that task force, and transit and transportation is really not on their radar. You know, housing capacity and support for existing affordable housing, as well as building new affordable housing, is their focus, really. But I haven't seen anything that really ties that to transit and RTD, and of course it has a statewide focus too.
Yeah.
This task force, so wouldn't necessarily specify RTD, but I haven't seen anything that ties affordable housing to public transportation as an example.
Interesting. Great. Thank you, Matt. Joanna.
I always like to ask this question, probably maybe Bill or Julie, one of you could answer. When we look at our transit mode share way into the future like that, what do other cities have in that estimate for themselves, or even now? Years ago, we used to go for a much higher mode share for transit as a goal, and it hasn't been reached. And now, and I know that's for Denver. What about places like LA or San Francisco or, I don't know, Salt Lake? I don't have any information on any of the other cities.
Yeah, I mean, I don't either.
Okay.
I know that, I mean, I would say for kind of the Western cities, we're probably in line, I'm assuming, with a lot of the Western cities. I would say probably Portland and Seattle are higher, but we're probably in line with places like Salt Lake, Dallas, probably maybe even LA. I'm not sure, although LA is kind of a different animal.
They always have been.
Yeah. So, but that's my assumption. And that's pure kind of more speculation on my part. I don't have those numbers in front of me.
That's okay. I just wondered if they, you all had run into that. The concern I have is, where does Colorado or the Denver metro area fit in with the national tendencies for all of these, travel demand issues about people working at home or not, and taking buses or trains, and also to what extent the climate change factor does have an impact. Maybe that's too short term. I don't know, but
right.
To me, it's a fair question. Anyway.
Right. And I think generally, I'll just say this about, transit. I think as an industry, we are kind of a little bit on our heels. I mean, everybody, I think, across the country is dealing with the same thing. Everybody's got their own unique challenges. We've got a lot of challenges because of our financial situation, but everybody's got that operator challenge pretty much. I don't think there's anybody I don't think I've heard of one transit agency that isn't experiencing that. And so, how do we, I think it's somewhat new in terms of just adding COVID on top of that and declining ridership before COVID. And now, how do we come out of COVID? And, think collectively as an industry, probably over the next couple of years, we're going to try to figure out what that role is and how do we play a bigger, part in mobility for, metro areas around the country. I just think it's something, that transit's going to have to figure out. And we're going to have to figure it out as kind of an industry and learning from each other and peers and all that kind of stuff, because I do think that's going to be a big part of it.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Say, Joe.
Well, I don't have a question, but I have a comment.
Please.
And that is, I'm looking at the 4 scenarios and hearing all the talk. And one of the assumptions that's present without being said is that RTD as an entity is going to be stable and not change. And so they may change to meet demand, but it's like the world's going to change around and RTD will just be there. And I think that is an assumption that can't be true, that RTD is going to have to adapt. And and part of that assumption is that the district is going to stay the way it is right now. And I'm not sure. I think the district might have to shrink. I think an assumption that RTD will continue to operate and try to build back service like it was is probably not good assumptions. I think you've probably heard me say this before. Does it make sense for RTD to run a bus system to subsidize the rail system? I don't think so. So my feeling is that there ought to be, and Bill, I don't know if you remember this, but the very first time you came to talk to us about Reimagine, I asked you if governance was going to be a part of Reimagine, and you said no. But I really think that at some point, if we're going to talk about what the world's going to look like in 2050, the assumption that RTD is going to look like it does now, with the same structure and the same governance and the same area that it serves, probably isn't really that good of an assumption. So that's just my opinion.
One thing I'll just respond, Joe, to your comment is that we are taking a look at things separately. This exercise right now is really kind of static. We are looking at the boundary issue separately. Actually, that is a scope item that we are looking as, what if we change our boundaries? And we've looked at both contracting and expanding, and what does either of those options mean? And so we'll be looking at that. That will be certainly part of it. The other thing I'll say is that we have heard, and I think some things have come out, is structurally how we might have to change to deal with some things. And as the issue that, and I think we've brought this term up before, is mobility integrator. If RTD is more of a mobility integrator, what does that mean? And does that mean structurally some of the agency has to change, because now we're kind of integrating other services to come together with a backbone of transit? And so I think there is that opportunity to make some suggestions for how RTD should change and evolve as part of this. I think when I talked to you before, I said RTD governance and dealing with the board structure is not part of this effort, because I'm not going to touch that one with a 10-foot pole. But if there is an idea that we need to change because we need to evolve as our role evolves, that certainly, I think, can be on the table.
Okay, I agree. Yes, the question I asked earlier, what, 1.5 years, 2 years ago, was a totally different context.
Yeah.
So I appreciate that, Bill, and thanks for your answer. I just really feel like, especially the funding issue, things are going to have to change somehow structurally within the agency. The agency is going to have to, as you put it, I like that word, evolve from what it is now to something else to survive and meet the needs. So thanks for your response, Bill. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Andrea?
Sorry, I was a little bit late, but I have to agree with what Joe said. And Reimagine is looking at structural changes to RTD. And I absolutely agree that the lines themselves are going to have to change. And I think I've already seen some of that happening. You really don't need 2 train lines down to the southeast and the southwest. Probably one would be sufficient. On the east, you may want the R line, but we are overbuilt with transportation possibilities. And I like, Bill, what you said, and thank you for Monday. I like, Bill, what you said about being the broker and bringing other means of transportation into the system. So yeah, and basically I do have to agree with Joe. Thank you.
Well, Joe, did you have a kind of a follow-up to that?
Yeah, and if I could jump in, Joe, I think your question was absolutely perfect. But we, even though, as Bill says, we're not theoretically talking about governance per se, and maybe we're not. I kind of interpret that as, well, who gets elected and how they get elected. I'm assuming we're definitely talking about, because we've raised it many times, the concept of local communities taking on more of the role of local service provider, and RTD kind of evolving into more of a regional service provider. That would be a pretty big shift. It would certainly have an implication for governance in the grand scheme of things. because the locals would have more control over kind of their local service provision that RTD now deals with. But I'm assuming that's on the table. And that may not come up in these 4 scenarios, to be sure, but the bigger picture, I think it needs to come up. So Joe, yeah, I think we're with you on those questions.
Well, and this scenario is going to get into several of these. So let's have Joe ask his last or make his last comment, and then we can jump in and kind of show you that the scenarios are addressing boundaries and some of these other things. So Joe, what's your thought?
Well, all I can say is I feel like I had my say. There's not much more to say about it. If I were doing it, I would give the rail system to Front Range Rail and tell them, there's your start, go for it. But I know it's not that simple, so.
Well, let's jump in. I know we'll have some other questions, but let's jump into the first scenario. You can kind of see how this plays out, because I do think this is going to get into some of the discussions. So just as a reminder, hopeful horizons. So we've got funding high, but we've got a lot of telework going on. So we do have money, which is great. But our demand is not as high as we would like to see, because we're seeing a lot of people working at home, for example. So with that, let me go. So here, and you do not have to stick with these at all, but what we wanted to do was provide some potential strategies. And our question to you is, what are the 3 to 5 on this list, or others that you would identify that you would do under this scenario, where you have funding high, but commute travel is low? So people are traveling in smaller areas. You don't have the morning and the afternoon peak the same. So, we've got, like I said, you don't have to pick one of these, but we wanted to sort of structure it. So, one of it is acting more of a regional mobility integrator. Maybe RTD should really be focusing on that broker role, as opposed to providing some direct service. Maybe it's focusing on high capacity, that regional backbone that Matt mentioned, that, allowing some of the locals to control a little bit more of the service at the local level, but everything feeds into this backbone of core service that RTD's provided. Maybe you focus on low capacity, short local service, smaller buses that don't require CDLs, maybe a more on-demand type of service. Partnerships, obviously, there's opportunities there. What would you think about electrification? What would you think about the fast track system, finishing that up? How about, what a priority would you put under the scenario around autonomous vehicles, for example, or bus rapid transit? Or, to Joe's point, shrinking or growing the district boundary size, and obviously always looking at increasing and diversifying funding sources. So again, these are the ones we came up with. You can come up with your own, or you could give us a thought. But if you were sort of running RTD and you were the RTD chair for the day, what would you, under the scenario, what would you prioritize? So, Joe, I didn't know if that was new or if your hand was still up from last time.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't take my hand down.
That's okay. I always forget to do that. I know, because you have to do that. So Andrea, your thoughts? Oh, you muted.
I had just unmuted. That's interesting. Anyway, I think from what Joe and Matt said, it's 1, 2, and where to go? Oh, 10 and 11. Just kind of feeds right into what they've been talking about.
Mm-hmm. So you're saying the commute travel is lower, but you've got money. So you'd look at the integrator role, you'd look at that backbone service, you'd look at changing, are you talking shrinking the district, I'm assuming? Would you?
Well,
it's the district?
maybe not actually the size of the district, but like I was saying, the number of routes.
Ah, okay. Okay, other thoughts on that? Travis?
Yeah, I'll walk through, I guess, a couple of my thoughts, but so I think number 2 is really strong, and it's partially because I think we evolve into a world with a lot of telecommuting. People's tolerance for longer commutes will become higher. So like we've seen people move from cities, because of this. And I think within the metro area, you'll see where someone that used to work downtown and have to commute every day might now be a lot more willing to live in Longmont, for instance, than they used to.
Because you're only doing it a couple of days a week.
So those like regional backbone services might actually end up playing a big role for the people that use it 1 or 2 days a week and need to go those really long distances. I think though as well, like there'll still be people commuting to work every day, but it might be a lot more focused on whether it's like service industry or manufacturing or medical stuff, the type of jobs where you have to go in person. And those ones tend to have more spread out shifts. They're not like peak rush hour, but they're, they start in sort of different points throughout the day. And so that's where I think like number 9 with some of the bus rapid transit corridors, where you can provide like a steady all day service, may actually be really strong for people that have a lot more flexibility when they travel, I guess. But those two really stood out to me. I do think the like regional mobility will become more of a situation in a world where people are not commuting as, because in a sense, if you're, for short trips and stuff, people are probably still going to rely on their car quite a bit. But yeah, longer trips are getting across the entire metro area, whether it's to a sporting game or the airport and stuff like that. Probably RTD will still be a really competitive option for that. And so you'll see a lot of people looking at transit for it. So
great, thank you. So it looks like we've got 1, 2, 9, 10, and 11 are sort of what people are focusing on. What are other thoughts, or anybody disagree with any of those under this scenario? Oh, Andrea.
I love what Travis just said. It's true. The only problem is I think we will always have downtown Denver in some way. I mean, I doubt it'll be back 100%, but there will always be a need to go down there. And like Travis said, games, I'm right, field and football, and yeah, so we'll always need that. And honestly, people love to have RTD service to the sports venues, but I still think there will be a need for the industry that is the central core of Denver. So we still will need to get people there.
Got it. Good point. That's a really good point. Matt, did you have a thought?
Yeah, I don't want to fixate on the data here particularly, but I am curious about a couple of things. So commute travel low, but what does that really mean in terms of what percentage of total transit travel is still commute travel versus non-commute travel? I mean, it's low relatively in the sense that it doesn't all come back because people are working from home. I buy that.
Right. No, that's a really good point, because what the model shows is boardings. And we don't have the modeler here, but I'm not sure the model this is not a model that goes to the route by route level. So it's not assuming this commuter route's in and this one's not. I think the idea is you're seeing you're just not seeing that it's changing, right? Where you're seeing your demand is changing. And so maybe it's less focusing on the commute downtown. To Andrea's point, there's still some of that, but it's more, maybe you're going east and west throughout the city and things like that. And so it's just assuming that it's reallocating those routes.
Well, yeah. So, I mean, the reason I ask is, in a lot of ways, dealing with the commute travel is the easiest, probably. People are going to
It's a good point.
employment centers, downtown Denver, Boulder to some extent, obviously the Federal Center, big employment centers. And if that's still a huge percentage or a really significant percentage, even though commute travel is low, then yeah, I guess I'm in agreement. I mean, I'm always in agreement on bus rapid transit. I think it's the best thing, way better than rail.
Okay, so you would add the BRT,
yeah, and yeah, I mean, I think we're always going to be in agreement that RTD should be moving towards regional backbone service, which is number 2, and doing more for integration, which is number 1. And I'd say integrating, it says third parties there. I'd say local governments as well, not just third parties thinking of the for-profit sector, but also local governments. But on the other hand, if non-commute travel is going to become a bigger percentage, and maybe a really significant percentage, then I have to say I'm a little puzzled, because that's really hard to serve. It's hard to serve.
Excellent point. Yeah, we
This is this is people going from everywhere to everywhere, all during the day, kind of semi-randomly. And that's where, yeah, these third-party providers and really super local transit works. And I don't know where RTD provides so much of that, except on, again, kind of the major routes. So let's say Halifax will always be a major route, whether it's commute or local. I got that. But some of the other routes, which really are more commute routes, I don't know. So that's where I'm kind of puzzled. It really depends how much that ratio changes. And does it mean RTD has to shift its priority or not? I'm a little unclear from these scenarios. Anyway, it's kind of.
It's a really good point. And I think that's part of what we have on here is there, and some of the discussions at the meetings last week were around, can RTD do something innovative around more on-demand type travel? Where maybe it's not house to house, maybe it's central locations within towns that do more on-demand trips and things like that. So you're absolutely right. It's much more complicated, but I definitely think there's a reality in that scenario we need to be thinking about. So I think that's a really good point. So let's take these last two and then move on, because we've already taken up a lot of your time, but this is fun. Andrea.
I think I'm going to go ahead and let Joanna have her.
Okay, Joanna.
Thank you. I don't know, maybe I'm missing something, but when we tried to look at mode share and we're talking about commute travel, aren't we trying to get a higher percentage of a forecasted amount of travel? If we're only getting a couple percent of the mode, it's being for transit, shouldn't we be saying, gee, we want to do better and capture more of that commute traffic because it's there, it's that we're not getting it? Is that correct?
Well, under this scenario, it's not, the commute travel is low. So we're just not seeing as many people wanting to do your normal commute under this particular scenario.
Even in terms of people who are driving their cars are still a low number too then.
Yes, I would assume that under this scenario. Absolutely. So this just assumes everybody's working at home. They're getting pretty comfortable working home. Maybe they go to the office 1 or 2 days a week sort of thing. And so to your point, to capture that ridership, RTD may have to look at other areas. That was to Matt's point of, but what if RTD looked at these local on-demand trips? Everybody's going everywhere. That's going to be really hard for a transit agency. We need to think about that. But I think that's the challenge under this scenario.
Okay, well, that helped clarify something for me. I did take a quick peek at some other cities. I'm not sure how good the data was, but it seems on the East Coast, there's quite a large mode share that uses transit, like 30 to 50%.
Interesting.
Not a surprise if you're living in New York, maybe.
Right.
And I had trouble finding cities our size, so.
Right. Well, and density plays a big role into that as well.
Yeah.
Andrea, did you want to?
Yeah, just a quick comment. I've been meeting with a committee at the South Metro Denver TMA, and those people are coming back to the office. So they're going to be commuting. A couple of them are everybody back in the office. A number of them are at least a couple of days. So there is still commuting out there, and I'd like to get those people onto transit, and they're really, really pushing it.
Excellent. That's great. Yeah, I read a fascinating, it was about a couple of months ago, New York Times, it was a poll, and the results of were 85% of CEOs wanted everybody back in the office full time, and 15% of employees wanted to be back in the office full time. I just thought that was a kind of a fascinating dynamic with this. Be interesting to see how it plays out. So let's move to the next one. So this was a little harder. This is dire days. So we're struggling. We've got workforce challenges, we got funding challenges, and we're not seeing people coming back to transit. We're seeing a lot of telecommuting. So under this scenario, RTD is not keeping pace with the need. The need is low, but RTD is still struggling to keep pace with that because of the lack of, it's more workers, but also kind of financials on this one. So in a scenario where we're struggling to keep at pace, but the demand's not even that super high. So this is sort of the worst case scenario. Would you prioritize the same things, or would you look differently at it? Joanna, are you, I don't know if you didn't put it down or, oh, you muted.
I should unmute myself. I was wondering if in this scenario, it might make sense to do more partnering with local agencies. I lost where's, oh, number 5.
Number 5, that's a good point.
More with, try to share some of the cost issues and maybe have some agencies would be more beneficial to provide some services. Just a thought.
No, that's a really good point. That kind of ties to some of the comments Matt made earlier,
Mhm.
for that local, hyper local sort of travel, especially. So under the scenario, would you also then lead toward the transit backbone, that core network?
Yes.
Okay.
Those go together well.
Two. Yep. Andrea? Oh, you're muted.
I'm still looking at 10 and 11. 11 would be really important, obviously, with the funding low. And
Yeah.
as much as I would love to see us electrify, that's just not possible with the money that's available.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, I want to see it electrified, but no, the money's just not there. That's a practical thing.
Mm-hmm. Good point. Matt?
Hey, I can give the same answer to every scenario. This is great.
Well, and that's interesting. We did see more consistency than we expected. I'll be honest, Matt, and I think that's good because part of what we're going to do with this is these are the things that we're going to develop some strategies around for the future. So it's a really interesting observation, but I think that's a great point.
Well, maybe the scenarios aren't
Dramatically different
enough.
Yeah.
Again, we're looking 30 years out, and the numbers are still within a pretty small range.
Right. That's a good point.
You think 30 years from now, if you took a different tack, the numbers would vary by a little bit more than 0.5% potentially. Anyway, all I was going to say is I would think in this case, you'd absolutely want partnerships with local agencies, which actually is not that different from number 11, increasing diversifying funding sources.
Right.
That is how you diversify your funding sources, because you partner with local agencies and they, we hope, providing some of that funding in order to do the kind of super local services. And otherwise, I think you provide the regional backbone service that the locals can't. You also do some of the integration that the locals probably can't. And that's probably where you put your most of your effort.
Great points. Thank you. Travis?
This comment probably applies both for this scenario and I think the next one, which is I think workforce shortages will just always be a problem at some level. They were a problem before COVID for RTD. It briefly got better and now it's really tough again for hiring environment. And to me, number 5, or depending how you define local agencies, I think in order to solve some of that workforce crunch is going to require partnering a lot more with other pools of eligible drivers. So for me, for instance, school buses is a really big example of one where RTD doesn't really think of themselves too much in the school business, although you do school trippers and stuff, but it'd be a whole lot more efficient rather than some school districts employing a driver to work for 2 hours at the start and the end of the day. If that was more tightly integrated into a role that actually worked, larger points part of the time, whether it's covering rush hour service and stuff like that. And I feel that's been an area where there's a lot of driver population, but they're completely separated out and maybe not as well leveraged within the community as a whole. And same for things like accessoride and stuff. I know there's a lot of counties and cities and agencies that provide, say, senior transport and stuff. And the same thing, probably don't make the best use of their team of drivers, and that there could be ways to partner to make that a more valuable resource for everyone.
So that's excellent. So it's not just about partnering in terms of funding, it's partnering in terms of maybe addressing workforce, sharing staff, helping to attract. That's a great point. Thank you, Travis. Matt?
Yeah, just gonna make a quick point about the zero emission fleet, which I'm all for electric buses. I just want to point out that there's lots of money out there from Xcel Energy on the charging infrastructure side, and then from some of the Senate Bill 260 electrification enterprises. There's a clean transit enterprise coming online next year that will offset, I expect, probably like the entire incremental cost of an electric bus versus diesel. So I mean, it should be on the list. It should be a priority for sure, but I just want to highlight, there's other funding opportunities. I think RTD's role is more around like planning and, facilitating the installation of charging stations in the depots, which is its own challenge, and then operating the buses.
Got it.
And then just second, I just had, I guess, a question about the first one, acting as a regional mobility integrator, and whether you could elaborate on that. Are we thinking like all of those services under one like monthly subscription, or is it more around like trip planning?
It's kind of all of that. I mean, the concept is just from a big picture perspective. There's so many different players in the market right now, and they're all coming in on the private sector side and the municipality side. You've got the scooters, you've got Ubers and Lyfts. Does it make sense for RTD to play that role of the umbrella organization that makes it seamless from the customer's perspective? So not that RTD, for example, would start providing scooters, but RTD would work with all these different organizations so that from a customer's perspective, it feels like it's all the same organization or the same agency. So that's the concept behind that. Anything else on that, Matt?
No, thanks for the explanation. I'd probably choose that one. And then, 10, 11, definitely important to diversify funding sources.
Great. And seek, obviously, these opportunities, especially for electric vehicles, the funding sources externally. That's excellent. Stephen, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, my question was, what's kind of like just generally, but for number 8 hasn't really been talked about, just the autonomous fleets, even in the low funding and high funding situation with your workforce and that being an obvious problem. What is the hesitation around autonomous vehicles or autonomous rail or buses, fleets?
I don't think, well, I mean, we got some feedback when we've done this exercise before that people were really pushing autonomous vehicles and early adoption of that because it addresses the long-term workforce issue. But the negative feedback we've heard has been, it's just the uncertainties associated with it, that the technology is not quite there, the regulatory environment for what happens if there's a crash, with an autonomous vehicle. So there's a lot of uncertainties there, but we have certainly heard feedback that people saying, you got to double down right now because that's the only thing that's going to fix your workforce issue. So we've heard all sorts of perspectives on that for sure.
Yeah, that's interesting because it's like Vancouver has like autonomous trains, and so it's not like this isn't like new things. I think you only for like the car, like buses would really be the issue.
Right. But the trains, to your point, yeah, that technology has come along a little bit further along for sure. So what is your take on that? Is that something you would think that RTD would want to focus on? Under the scenario, you don't have a lot of funding, but you also have a big workforce issue. So how do you address that? That's an interesting question.
Well, kind of like touching back on if you're low funding, and if, to be honest, you just want to be really upfront about it, where like this is just a commuter rail, like this is just to get you to your job and back, then you should really just focus on as much reliable and efficient, and also quick routes to get to your job and back. And to be honest, for just times as well as too, I mean, for me, like more of a working class person, I never really had like the 9 to 5. So when I had to get off at 8 p.m. and have maybe miss the last bus for the day, it's like that doesn't help anyone. But if I were to find another job that was a bit more 9 to 5 and that can get me there in 10, 20 minutes, or equivalent to a car, that would have been a lot better.
That's a good point. Great. Well, thank you for your thoughts on that. That's not one we had discussed yet, so that's great. Well, we've got 2 more. Go ahead, Stephen. Or no, I guess Stephen was already there. Sorry, Danny.
Hi. If it's okay, also, I'm going to keep my camera off. I'm a trainer and my camera's on all the time, and I'm kind of videoed out.
No problem. We understand. We're all
Thanks.
zoomed to death.
Yeah. There are a few things that interest me here. And one thing in general, and I feel like the last answer is, or last part of this is getting at some of this, is I really always focus on the experience of it, of writing, and how will the experience of writing bring people in? And a lot of these don't get at that. And I'm fascinated by how we are so often looking at things to do or get or buy or invest in or whatever, funding things. We so rarely, until I bring it up, talk about what is it like to ride, and will that get more people on? And I think, is it Stephen? Yeah, talking about like I don't have a 9-to-5, there isn't a bus. Well, that's getting into some into the experience, but I'm curious about quality over quantity in a lot of things. And I'm wondering why isn't that more of the regular calculus in some of these discussions, I guess, is one thing, or is that separate? Are there other groups looking at the experience? So I'm thinking of like qualitative stuff over quantitative sometimes. And when we're talking about different levels of people like writing, I really think we need to spend more time on what kinds of things the experience would get people there. And it makes me think of a recent experience I had. This person did not know I'm part of this committee or anything. And I was waiting at the University of Denver stop, and a new student came up to me because I was just standing around and asked, how do I use this system? There were no signs about how to use this system when you first walk up. If you drive up and you're walking from the garage, then there's stuff over there. And I was looking all over, and he was asking where to pay. And I said, I'm sorry, I don't know. And I looked everywhere. But then it wasn't until another trip that I saw it's way over on the end by the garage. And I just thought there are some things like that are not very welcoming. There are things like stairs to get into our trains. No one has ever answered my question about why that is what we have, and could that ever change? And it's not very accessible. It's ableist. There are these different things like that I feel like could possibly bring in people on the experience, because still in this metro, it is more pleasurable, let's say, that's a weird way to put it, to drive a car, even in a lot of traffic, than it is to ride our systems. That's kind of where I'm coming from with this.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And we have, that is a component of this. In fact, we did a full like statistically valid community survey last year. And part of what we had researched in that is, what would it take for you to ride? You know, what are those barriers? What are the things? And interestingly, some of the things you just came up with definitely were fed into that. But the number one thing that we got was, it's got to be reliable. That there's a real challenge right now. If I need to get to work and my bus doesn't show up in time, then this is not a system that I would use. So that was certainly one of the ones that we got. We also got feedback on just location of stations being a huge piece of that. If the station is accessible, walkable to my house or close to my house, I'm going to ride more often. So we do have some of those sort of quality of life pieces of that, but I really appreciate you reinforcing that, because that is obviously a key kind of embedded in all of this is, you know, the system only works if we can convince people to ride it, right? So what is it that people need? And certainly reliability was one of those big pieces, but also some of the quality of life experiences. You know, we got feedback along the lines of, you know, sometimes it's not great to wait at a station if you don't have a canopy, if it's hot or cold, or, you know, something along those lines.
Yeah.
So no, I appreciate, so it is definitely something we're looking at. This particular scenario is really focusing more on, you know, kind of the bigger picture, the role of RTD moving forward. But your point is very well taken. I really appreciate that, Danny. So I'm going to go to the last two, because we're already at 5 after 4, and I want to give you a couple minutes on your other things. So the last couple here. So this is exploring efficiencies. So this is this is similar to, so this is probably going to be pretty similar to, I think I got us off track. I apologize. I think I moved the slide forward. So we were talking kind of dire days. This is not as bad. The funding is low, but there's an opportunity here because people are really riding the system. And so yes, you're struggling to meet the demand, but there's a positive side to here, which is people are getting passionate and excited about riding transit again. So, you know, again, kind of same thing. What would you do differently, if anything? Is it still sort of focusing on the regional backbone, diversifying funding sources, partnerships? What do you guys think? Damie, did you have your hand up again, or was your hand up before?
Oh, sorry, I will lower it.
Oh, that's okay. I know. I always
Good.
forget to lower mine. Andrea?
I'm still at 1, 2, 10, and 11. I really think they need to,
Yep.
if not actually change the boundary, change how many lines are out there.
Yep. So when you say that, are you saying focus more on areas with higher demand? I mean, are you talking about reallocating the routes? Is that what you mean?
Yes, there you go. That's
Got it.
a good
Okay.
word.
Okay, great. Does anybody have a different perspective? Hi, Matt. What are you thinking?
Yeah, again, broken
Pretty
record.
similar, yeah.
I would say for number 11, really what's key is number 5, partnership with local agencies. And so they're the ones that can provide the
Kind of fill that need.
system last mile.
Yeah.
And then if commute travel really were high, along with number 2, I would say number 9, because the best way to provide a regional backbone service is through investment in bus rapid transit, at least where you can do it, not everywhere, but
Got it.
you can do it. A really good regional backbone is, to me, the definition of it is bus rapid transit.
Mm-hmm.
Just those.
Great, thank you. Joanna?
Oh, I was, I'm not muted, good. I was just about to say number 9 could be added into that, and Matt said it, so that's great.
Good, excellent. Let's see, let's go to the very last one here, favorable futures. So this is Ben's scenario. He got it last week, which is you got money and you got demand. This is a fantastic scenario for us. So this is kind of the ultimate upside. So in the ultimate upside scenario, would you do anything differently, or is it kind of similar to some of the discussions we've had? Andrea?
Obviously now kick in the zero emission fleet.
Got it.
And autonomous, you can make the change given enough money. You can go to autonomous trains. I wouldn't expect the buses to be autonomous because there's so much diversity on the roads, paying attention to cars.
Yeah.
But yeah, to get into zero emission, absolutely.
So is this in sort of in addition to the other things we've talked about? So you would still
Yes.
look the core back. So, but in addition, you have some additional money. So let's start looking at electrification and autonomous vehicles.
Yes.
Got it. Excellent. Other thoughts? Does everybody agree? Does anybody say, nah, I wouldn't look at electrification or zero emission or?
I like the zero emission, partly because with regard to climate change, there's no more early adoption as far as like science goes. We're behind as a society. So I think zero emission should come, and I think built into that should be kind of efforts for resilience measures, and the cost of that, getting a fleet like that far outweighs the cost of recovery efforts after different kinds of events related to climate change. And
excellent point. And that could be the fleet as well as their infrastructure, right? Buildings, facilities. That's a great point. Thank you. Hey, Matt?
Well, if they really had lots of money, I'd suggest that they provide the CAC with dinner at every one of our meetings.
Yeah.
I will make that down. CAC
But that isn't on the list. So
it says other. You can put that under other.
I wouldn't change much. I would love to see zero emission fleet. I don't know how much we can push that for a lot of reasons. I think the technology will get us there. I am not holding my breath on autonomous fleets. I mean, rail, yeah, you could probably do it. Buses, I don't even think by 2050 you would do it. I would, if you really had more money and commute travel was high, I think what you'd really want to focus on is exactly the problems we have now, which is the first and final mile.
Mhm.
And that's with, partnerships with local agencies, et cetera, et cetera. But maybe if you have money, you also incentivize that in some way because you've got some money to do that.
Mhm.
And then the second thing, and you raised this just before in your survey about what people wanted, reliability, I would say is you use your money to improve the reliability.
Wow, got it.
And to reduce headways where you can. Because that's what gets people to use transit is when, the famous throw away the schedules, the bus will be there.
Yep, absolutely.
We can use it. And that's not quite on this list either, but that's some of the extra money.
No, that's a good point. It kind of builds on, Danny's comments from earlier. If there's so much money, maybe we start improving station platforms and we get every station stop up to ADA compliance and things like that. So there's a lot of sort of quality of life, sort of experiential things that if RTD was in this scenario with that kind of money, that would be a great focus.
Yeah, that too, for sure. And boy, do I agree with him. Whoever decided to buy the light rail cars with those stupid stairs, that is about the worst design I have ever seen. Although they're in some other parts of the country too, to be fair, and overseas. It's not like we're the only people that have. That is, and I'm pretty agile still, but they're pretty unusable. Sorry, that would be money well spent as well.
Great.
Yeah, and the best way I would put it is that I honestly feel that those steps in our trains are an untenable situation. We at some point will need to get away from them. I don't know what that will look like. That seems like a huge cost and everything. Yeah. But I do feel like at some point those will need to go away. But I'm sure that's just a whole other project.
Right.
And I'm not for this meeting, but I do have some history on the vehicles that I can give you a little bit of where they are, why we are where we are. But your last statement is 100% correct. It would be extremely expensive for us to transition to level boarding light rail vehicles.
Mm-hmm.
But
under this scenario, we're going to a zero emission fleet, so we're going to replace all the trains anyway.
Yeah, we're going to have all the money in the world, so sure.
There you go. So you fix it. Matt Frommer.
Yeah, a fun scenario indeed. I think what I would do is focus on just service, just get it all to 15-minute frequency. I would increase wages for drivers and operators. And then I would build out more bus rapid transit to try to make transit the more convenient option.
Got it.
And then while we're at it, let's just make it all free.
I like that. And Bill did respond to your question I saw. I think it was from you about the elasticity of free fare. So that is definitely something that's going to be evaluated in the fare study as well.
Cool.
All right. I think we have time for one more comment. Travis, what are your thoughts on this scenario?
I was just going to say on the light rail part. So Dallas, or lots of cities use those high step light rail cars, but Dallas went and took them apart and put a middle section in them. If you ever see in Dallas, which is a low floor. So there are ways that can get modified. Don't be totally discouraged that it's stuck that way for life. There's hope that it can get modified or someday down the road replaced with new light rail cars. But
terrific. Thank you for that feedback. Yes, you're right. I'd forgotten that at Dallas. Absolutely. Well, we're at quarter after, and I know you guys have, Matt, did you have something new or let you throw in a lot. Okay. But you only have 15 minutes for the rest of your meeting. So I definitely want to give you that opportunity. This has been fantastic. We loved coming and visiting with you guys. You always give us really great thoughts and great observations. And I'm really, I took some really good notes. So we'll be passing these along to the technical team. And again, this is going to start informing, we're actually starting to develop recommendations now for the mobility plan for the future, as well as our systems optimization plan. And so the next round, love to come back again and start actually getting your perspective on if we recommend this, we recommend that. Do you think we're on the right track? And have a little bit more discussion on priorities. So with your permission, we would love to come back.
Yeah, hey, thanks, Julie and Bill. Thanks so much. We'd love to have you back. As you know, we consider this one of the two main projects we're going to be working on for some time. The FAIR study being, of course, the other one because of huge implications it has for how the system will look in the future. But this is something everybody has shown great interest in. So thanks. Keep bringing new ideas and scenarios, and we'll keep trying to give you some good responses. And maybe next time we'll even do it in person.
Oh, wouldn't that be nice?
That'd be great.
Bill's buying dinner apparently, I hear too. So
Yeah.
Yeah, right. But all that money you've got, you can buy.
Yeah.
Hey,
terrific.
thanks so much.
Thank you
All
so
right.
much. You guys have a great
All
day.
right.
We'll
Bye.
look forward to seeing you soon. Bye-bye.
Well, for those of you who can hang in for a little bit longer, if you looked at the agenda that Roger provided us, we just have a few things we thought we would talk about fairly briefly before we disband for today. And the first one is our next month in November, we are going to meet with Deborah Johnson. She's, of course, the general manager of RTD, and it'll be the first time we've really met with her. And I think the question just is, besides saying hi and getting to know each other, are there any things you'd really like Deborah to come prepared to talk about, or any questions in advance where we could give her a heads up? We're not trying to, catch her unprepared on something. So are there any ideas you have, things you'd like to talk to Deborah about, things you'd like her to talk to us about that you might want to suggest? And then Roger will watch this tape and he'll take notes on all of it, and he'll talk to Deborah before the meeting in November. Yeah, Andrea?
I'm curious what she might think about a change in governance, because there have been so many ideas thrown around, and Reimagine is probably going to give her something. I'd like to know where she is on that issue.
Matt, I'm guessing she won't touch that with a 10-foot pole.
Yeah, that's my guess too.
Yeah, that's a political thing, and she's a professional manager, and no, I can't imagine that she would take that on. I mean, it's an issue that's out there. Even the accountability committee wouldn't take that on. And that says a lot to me.
Right.
I think if we're going to ask that question, we need to ask that of Angie Melpietti.
Right. I agree.
That's where
Well,
it needs to go to the board chair.
But I think a question that's in a way similar, again, it's not exactly governance, but it's how the system is funded and managed, would be what we've been talking about all day today, which is, does she think RTD maybe needs to move more towards doing more of the regional services and trying to get the locals to little by little start doing more of the local service, both managing it and paying for it, and then integrating under the RTD umbrella? I think, and that's a political question too, but she might be willing to touch on that.
You guys, I don't know, back in the late 70s, after RTD came into being, the model for a while, not for a long time, was exactly that. The locals were providing and plugging into RTD. That was supposed to be the model. And then they ditched that model and went to the grid system and providing, kind of being the elephant in the room model. But that's not a new idea, and I'm not saying it's a bad idea. I'm just saying I think that's what's motivating Boulder. I could be wrong, Matt, you probably know better, but I think part of what's motivating Boulder and the sub-regional council idea that's in the governor's report is that they feel they can go out and raise money locally to support transit that RTD could never raise as a region-wide proposition. So that's just kind of what I've been hearing.
All right, well, okay, so let's talk to her about that for sure. Other things you might want to raise with her while we've got her for a little while next month?
Matt, I'd really like to hear her talk about the driver shortage and in the union and just what they're thinking in terms of how to deal with that issue. And I guess what I think is really interesting is that you just don't hear any discussion about raising the hourly rate for drivers in order to attract more people. And I mean, that seems like a pretty simple solution, even though it's expensive for them. But just that whole issue of, what's her take on the driver shortage and how that gets solved in this environment?
Okay. Anybody else?
Matt, John Fusa.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry for joining late due to a work conflict. I'd love to hear, I guess, just two things. One would be Deborah's view of the agency kind of as benchmarked against peer agencies. Kind of how are we doing here at RTD in the Denver metro region against peers? There's some of that in the accountability committee report and some other documents, but I'd love to hear her take or view on it. Right? We very often we compare ourselves to peers, number one. Number two, I'd love to hear about opportunities and or challenges for partnerships, particularly at the intergovernmental level, state level with CDOT, for example, some of the counties, even Amtrak and the like for some on rail. So just some discussion about partnership opportunities to help RTD as it moves into the future, whether it's on the capital side or service side or something else.
Anybody else?
Yeah, I definitely second that point about partnerships. I think both at the local level and then also with CDOT. Currently CDOT's developing this greenhouse gas planning rule for all transportation plans, where they're basically anticipating about a 10 or 11% reduction in VMT by 2030. And if you look at like the compliance scenario, the main strategy is like transit. It's like a 70% increase in transit service. And that's against pre-pandemic levels. I think we're now 70% below that. So we've got to like restore service, then go 70% above that, which seems completely disconnected from what I'm hearing from RTD. So I'd like to ask Deborah about that, and working with CDOT leadership and DRCOG to increase service, potentially use like some of the multimodal options fund money, maybe talk about the HUTF. I don't know if that's like on the table, but other funding opportunities now that we have this GHG planning rule in place. And then the second thing, because that's an easy one. Now the second thing would be land use. Since they've just heard at Reimagine RTD from DRCOG, they have all these scenarios, and it's become clear that like you could theoretically increase transit ridership just with land use strategies only. Like if you upzoned, say all land within a quarter mile of every transit station, you would increase transit service without basically having to spend any money on transit infrastructure itself. I mean, eventually the system would be overwhelmed and you'd increase service, but it is like a huge, huge strategy. And I wonder how RTD's thinking about it and approaching that.
All right, well,
Here, I would make a comment. I'm counting on Roger getting the transcript from this.
yes.
So he can write all these things down. I think it would be appropriate that we give Deborah a list of potential talking points that we're going to talk about ahead of time, so we don't catch her, by surprise on anything. Also, the rest of our committee that did not attend today should be invited to submit some ideas too.
Yeah, no, I think the idea clearly was that Roger was going to capture these and in fact let her know about them so she could come in prepared to answer or not, the case may be, depending on the question. And yeah, if anybody has any other thoughts, and we kind of, brought this up, a little bit out of the blue today, but if you have any other thoughts, just send an email to Roger, because he'll be the one collecting them and passing them on. And this doesn't mean we can't have a conversation with her in real time at the meeting and other questions will come up, but this way at least she can come in knowing, okay, here's a half a dozen things we are interested in, and hopefully she'll respond. So that's great. Thank you all for offering your ideas. And again, feel free to send Roger some additional information. The next thing we had on the agenda here was just some future agenda items. Two of them, of course, the FAIR study and equity analysis, and the second one, information technology and data. And what Roger said is, not surprisingly, the FAIR study is still kind of moving slowly. They're, getting consultants and so on and so on. I'm going to try to bring up his notes here. Yeah, so this is still in procurement. They expect to have somebody hired by December, and the process won't get started until early 2022. So I think what that means for us is that we'll keep nagging to be part of it, but probably nothing much will happen until early 2022, February, March, April 2022, something like that. The technology and data, which has come up in this group a lot, I've certainly raised it, but a lot of you have raised it too, on the theory that, hey, the FAIR study and even Reimagine is based so much on data that is, shall we say, questionable. This is where he does stuff. And then technology in general in RTD, which is kind of really behind the times. That Roger seemed to think maybe we could have on an agenda in January if people are interested in that. And we could talk to the people at RTD who actually do that and get a better understanding of what they're doing and what their plans are for future improvements. And I think that'd be a really cool meeting. Because
do you have an agenda for November? I would love to see that soon.
Well, November is Deborah. I think that's the main event for November. And
yeah, that makes sense.
And we'll talk about December in a minute, but I think Roger thinks he can set that up for January. Mm-hmm. So okay with everybody. That's kind of a short-term view of where we're going. We might as well talk about the December meeting, and then we'll talk about the last item. So we know November has Deborah, and I'm sure some other things will pop up. I don't know how much time Deborah will give us. We've just asked enough questions that she could be with us the whole time, but we'll see what she feels like. December we could do or not do. It's really entirely up to us. I don't know if we'd have much luck getting presentations for December, given when our meeting is scheduled and holidays and so on. So we could take that meeting off, which I think is fairly typical, but it's really up to the group. What would you like to do?
I would note we have not had meetings in December in the past. So it is possible to make that decision again.
I vote no on December. Let's just don't have a meeting.
Anybody else? You know,
I'm
we have a
good
lot.
I'm
Go
good
ahead.
either way.
Yeah, okay, so at least tentatively, let's say probably not a meeting in December. Roger can take another look at that, but I think from what Roger told us, it could be really difficult to get people to come talk to us in the middle of December, as you might imagine. And then we'll tee up the data collection and technology for January and assume we'll do something on the FAIR study also in the first quarter, and we'll see what else pops up. And then the last piece, and I wasn't around when you guys did this, so you old timers can talk about this. Roger raised the question of should we go back to or restart the concept of having 2-on-1 meetings with RTD board members, where 2 of us from the CAC get together with an RTD board member just to chat, just to get to know each other, and, you know, see where they're at. There's 15 board members. It would take a while to see them all, but that's okay. So those of you who've done this,
Great idea.
it worked well.
Yes,
I think it's a great idea. I've participated a lot, and it's really good. It's very useful.
I would second that for sure.
Okay. Well, hearing at least nothing against it, let's tell Roger to work on setting this up. This would clearly not happen until next year. That's pretty obvious. And I'm hoping by then we could actually meet people in person. It's obviously more work to meet people in person. It's kind of easy to sit at home here and talk to people. But I have to say, at least my point of view, maybe because I'm an old guy, if you get to really meet somebody, it really helps to meet them in person. And, you know,
yeah, we did always meet them in person in the past, and we went out to lunch usually. So Roger would be part of that meeting, and then the board member plus 2 of us. And we signed up. We'd get dates that the board members were available, and then people from the CAC would sign up and say, I'm available to go to lunch at that time at that place. And
so let's tell Roger to work on that and tell him to maybe find a few board members who are willing to do it early next year. And then Roger could send out a little sign up asking for, okay, who's interested in meeting with this person, and, you know, give us the date and time and so on. But this will give us a lot of lead time, which I think
he has that. He knows how.
Given people's schedules, I think that's really important, is to give us, because I want everybody in this group to get a chance to do it. This should not just be a few of us. This needs to be everybody needs to be involved in this. It's a great way to meet the board members. Okay, that was the last thing on Roger's agenda. Anything else that people have that should be brought up?
Matt, just as a follow-up, I know, I don't think it was the last meeting before, we spent a lot of time talking about and reacting to the accountability committee report. And whatever happened to that?
Well, so the RTD board did do a full response that actually pretty much, at least when I looked at it, pretty much tracked our recommendations. I don't think it was because we were so brilliant. That'd be nice to think. But I think honestly, we were on topic and on track with the our recommendations to the board. But the board mostly did track it. And I don't know what happened since that. I don't know if the accountability committee came back and said, well, no, we don't agree with you, or if the governor or the legislature is going to come back and say, well, too bad, we're going to go do something else anyway. That's a really good question. And maybe we won't go till the legislature's back in session.
But just, I think maybe as a follow-up, that would be interesting to get the board's response distributed to us, just so we have that as a reference point.
That would be good. And actually, that reminds me of another thing that we raised somewhere along the line, which is, why don't we get some of the people from the legislature to come talk to us at one of the meetings, the people who are working on transit issues, to come talk to us about what their concerns and ideas might be. Because I think that would be really, that wouldn't happen until probably February or something like that, but that's okay. I think that would be kind of interesting. And that would also let us ask them directly what they thought about the accountability committee and RTD's response to it. Because that's
Great idea.
Yeah, okay. Anything else?
Matt, John Fusa again. I just wanted to just quickly mention that down here in District G on the southeast side of the district, Director Julian Bouquet is having a series of 2 to 3 kind of listening sessions with the residents and his constituents in District G. So I think that's a terrific idea. And we look forward to, I'll be as a citizen at least one of those meetings. So I think that's a great idea. We look forward to hearing from him and kind of hearing what the residents down here on the far southeast corner of the district have to say to their director. So just wanted to mention that.
John, how can I get information about those?
I have it, or I have the ability to put my hands on it. So I'm happy to provide that to you, perhaps through Roger, if that's okay.
That would be wonderful, because that's
Okay.
my area, but I'm in H, like I touched District G.
Okay. So give me a day or two, and if it's okay with you, I will email that information to Roger with a request to Roger to forward it to you or to anybody else who might be interested out here in the burbs. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Okay, so I think we're good. Joanne, do you have any other thoughts about where we're at?
No, it seems like we've done pretty well today.
Okay. Well, so we will regroup for our normal meeting in November. Again, tentatively, we won't have one in December, but we will have one in November, which promises to be really interesting because we're the general manager here, and that'll be a great opportunity for us to talk to her and to get to know her a little bit and get some of those questions answered. Thanks, everybody. It was a great meeting as always, and look forward to seeing you virtually again in November.